all to be cared for, and most importantly, recorded in her sketches and paintings. And among her natural gifts, she was blessed with a vivid imagination, and this she exercised to great effect. Surely animals had feelings like our own, and like children, they could be very naughty, which prospect Beatrix hugely enjoyed.
She's talking about Beatrix Potter.
Why are the little books still to this day loved and cherished the world over, translated into countless languages and used to bring to tiny children? Because all the ingredients of a good yarn are there: expectation, suspense, danger, humor, and satisfactory resolution. The little books are owner-friendly on account of their size and can be held by small hands without difficulty. They are therefore not overwhelming for a little person learning to read. Beatrix has appreciated good writing, which is borne out in the evidence of her own narrative style. And she loved secrets. Didn't she, as a young woman, keep a coded diary which remained undeciphered until 1958? She loved secrets, as did many little animals, it would seem. This probably helped tiny creatures feel safe from the threatening harm of their larger cousins. Contrary to the mistaken opinion of some, there is no sentimentality involved. She had a scientific mind. Don't forget that Beatrix and her brother Bertram actually boiled a rabbit, stripping it literally down to the bare bone in order to find out what the bone structure was like, which is why her little animals have such a convincing aura of stored-up energy and potential movement, each according to its species, despite being kitted out in human clothing.
He killed his birds.
She is never afraid to recognize the predatory nature of the animal world, right down to the smallest species. After all, she had owned some of these animals, a favorite rabbit named Benjamin, who accompanied her on a lead, and whom she immortalized in the tale of Benjamin Bouncer, mice who featured to great effect in the tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse, the tale of Two Bad Mice, and many others. She had observed their behavior in every detail and at very close quarters. And she doesn't hold back from endowing her animals with human emotions. We know full well that our domestic pets and the beloved horses that we ride are capable of varying emotional moods, affection, fear, jealousy, greed, grief, and they don't hold back from showing it. Beatrix had her share of life's trials and tribulations, and sturdy as she was, sometimes to the point of stoicism, she was not immune to heartbreak. Her work on the little books had brought her into close contact with Norman Warne at the publishing house, a sensitive and encouraging colleague, and their growing empathy resulted in romance and promise of future happiness. Soon after their engagement, disapproved of by her parents as Norman was considered to be of trade, that happiness was snatched away by the cruel fact of her fiancé's death. So she knew what loss and grief were, but she also knew what recovery was, and like any member of the animal kingdom, in the interest of sheer survival, she must pick herself up find healing for her wounds, and go forward. It would be 11 years before she would find contentment in a loving partnership with the lawyer who completed the conveyancing of all her property purchases, 14 farms in all, in England's beautiful Lake District. From the 13th of October 1913, she was proud to be addressed as Mrs. William Heelis. Like all good stories, the tale of Peter Rabbit begins, as do several of the tales, with "once upon a time." Like all good writing, there is an unmistakable rhythm in the construction of her prose, obviously also in Apple Dapple's and Cecily Parsley's nursery rhymes, so making it easier to remember or even learn the text. Her intention was to express herself simply, in the manner of the Bible, as she put it, and she would revise and clarify until she was satisfied. She had an ear for the onomatopoeic, inventing sounds made by animal movements. "Zzz, whiz, whiz," replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. That from the tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse. While they were in difficulties, there was a pit-pat-paddle-pat, and 3 puddle ducks came along the hard high road, marching one behind the other and doing the goose step. Pit-pat, paddle-pat, pit-pat, waddle-pat, from the tale of Tom Kitten. "Hark! I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap it. Why, I really believe it's a little black rabbit," from Apple Dapple's nursery rhymes. And finally, a great big enormous trout came up, ka-pop-flop-pop-pop-pop, with a splash, and seized Mr. Jeremy with a snap, from the tale of Mr. Jeremy Fisher. And Beatrix used the wonderful word scuttering to good effect. She was accustomed to hearing the scuttering of mice, and sometimes rats, of whom she was singularly unafraid, in her own home, the 17th century farmhouse she bought in 1905 from the royalties of her first book, The Tale of Peter Rabbit. It is, of course, the visual that implants itself into the memory, and the exquisite illustrations bear this out. It is acknowledged that Beatrix Potter was a very fine watercolorist. She admitted herself that the urge to paint everything she saw of interest was compelling. And as young ladies in her station in life were tutored in the fine art of painting, her natural gifts, to her great delight, were constantly being exercised. The renowned Victorian artist John Everett Millais was a close friend of the family too, and freely offered his advice and encouragement. Who can forget the images of Mrs. Tiggywinkle, Jemima Puddle Duck, Mr. Todd, the wily fox, Squirrel Nutkin, Pigling Bland, in fact, all of them. The tales are very moral. Evil does not triumph. Justice is done, and the balance of power, at least temporarily, is restored, as indeed are peace and security, though she seems to be saying we must be ever watchful, which is why, if she were alive today, she would be vociferous in the cause of conservation, as indeed she already was in her lifetime, warning us now of the threatening evidence of climate change and our responsibility to the wonderful world of nature whose beauty and function we have so disregarded. Sir David Attenborough would have an equally indefatigable ally in her, for she was an effective protester, managing to gather support for her case against the testing of seaplanes over Lake Windermere, and succeeding in putting a stop to it. In 1996, I undertook to depict this remarkable woman in a play written by the theatre director, writer, and poet Patrick Garland, in collaboration with Judy Taylor, one of the greatest authorities on Beatrix Potter and her books, and until recently, chairman of the Beatrix Potter Society. The scene throughout was in the kitchen at Hilltop, a wonderful recreation by the brilliant theatre designer Julia Trevelyan-Oman. Set in her 60s, the two acts ranged in memory over Beatrix's life. All the words were her own, spoken or written by her at some time, and of course, snatches of the tales were included. In 2016, I presented a documentary for television about her life, a fascinating and satisfying exercise. And I'm pleased to be patron of the Beatrix Potter Society, which links people from all over the world in enthusiastic determination to make sure that her contribution to literature, art, and the proper regard for the natural world are not forgotten. Beatrix Potter's life was eventually a fully rounded and fulfilled one, for she responded completely to her instincts, turning her back on the sophistication of London life to embrace her calling as a genuine creature of the land and its inhabitants. We are all part of nature, she seems to say, and it is essential that we should all realize that from as early an age as possible. We are, quite simply, one big family. And so, let us begin at the beginning.
The Tale of Peter Rabbit, 1902. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank underneath the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dears," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields or down the lane, but don't go into Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there. He was put in a pie by Mrs. McGregor. Now run along and don't get into mischief. I'm going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuces and some French beans, and then he ate some radishes, and then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of a cucumber frame, whom should he meet but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees, planting out young cabbages, but he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a rake and calling out, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened. He rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes among the cabbages, and the other shoe amongst the potatoes. After losing them, He ran on 4 legs and went faster, so that I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately run into a gooseberry net and got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears, but his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop upon the top of Peter. But Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him, and rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water in it. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed, perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. He began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter sneezed. Mr. McGregor was after him in no time and tried to put his foot upon Peter, who jumped out of a window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, and he was tired of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest. He was out of breath and trembling with fright, and he had not the least idea which way to go. Also, he was very damp with sitting in that can. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity-lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in a wall, but it was locked, and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the wood. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth that she could not answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to a pond where Mr. McGregor filled his water cans. A white cat was staring at some goldfish. She sat very, very still. But now and then, the tip of her tail twitched as if it were alive. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his cousin, little Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of a hoe. Scratch, 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 scratch. Peter scuttered underneath the bushes, but presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed upon a wheelbarrow and peeped over. The first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing onions. His back was turned towards Peter, and beyond him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along a straight walk behind some blackcurrant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him at the corner, but Peter did not care. He slipped underneath the gate and was safe at last in the wood outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes for a scarecrow to frighten the blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him till he got home to the big fir tree. He was so tired that he flopped down upon the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in a fortnight. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well during the evening. His mother put him to bed and made some chamomile tea, and she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoonful to be taken at bedtime. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. The end. The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, 1903. This is a tale about a tail. A tail that belonged to a little red squirrel, and his name was Nutkin. He had a brother called Twinkleberry and a great many cousins. They lived in a wood at the edge of a lake. In the middle of the lake, there is an island covered with trees and knot bushes, and amongst those trees stands a hollow oak tree, which is the house of Owl, who is called Old Brown. One autumn, when the nuts were ripe and the leaves on the hazel bushes were golden and green, Nutkin and Twinkleberry and all the other little squirrels came out of the wood and down to the edge of the lake. They made little rafts out of twigs, and they paddled away over the water to Owl Island to gather nuts. Each squirrel had a little sack and a large oar and spread out his tail for a sail. They also took with them an offering of 3 fat mice as a present for Old Brown, and put them down upon his doorstep. Then Twinkleberry and the other little squirrels each made a low bow and said politely, "Old Mr. Brown, will you favour us with permission to gather nuts upon your island?" But Nutkin was excessively impertinent in his manners. He bobbed up and down like a little red cherry, singing, riddle me, rot-tot-tote, a little wee man in a red, red coat, a staff in his hand and a stone in his throat. If you'll tell me this riddle, I'll give you a groat." Now this riddle is as old as the hills. Mr. Brown paid no attention whatever to Nutkin. He shut his eyes obstinately and went to sleep. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts and sailed away home in the evening. But next morning they all came back again to Owl Island, and Twinkleberry and the others bought a fine fat mole and laid it on the stone in front of Old Brown's doorway and said, "Mr. Brown, will you favour us with your gracious permission to gather some more nuts?" But Nutkin, who had no respect, began to dance up and down, tickling old Mr. Brown with a nettle and singing, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, hitty-pitty within the wall, hitty-pitty without the wall. If you touch hitty-pitty will bite you." Mr. Brown woke up suddenly and carried the mole into his house. He shut the door in Nutkin's face. Presently a little thread of blue smoke from a wood fire came up from the top of the tree, and Nutkin peeped through the keyhole and sang, "A house full, a hole full, and you cannot gather a bowl full." The squirrels searched for nuts all over the island and filled their little sacks. But Nutkin gathered oak apples, yellow and scarlet, and sat upon a beech stump playing marbles and watching the door of old Mr. Brown. On the 3rd day, the squirrels got up very early and went fishing. They caught 7 fat minnows as a present for Old Brown. They paddled over the lake and landed under a crooked chestnut tree on Owl Island. Twinkleberry and 6 other little squirrels each carried a fat minnow, but Nutkin, who had no nice manners, brought no present at all. He ran in front, singing, "The man in the wilderness said to me, 'How many strawberries grow in the sea?' I answered him, as I thought good, 'As many red herrings as grow in the wood.'" But old Mr. Brown took no interest in riddles, not even when the answer was provided for him. On the 4th day, the squirrels brought a present of 6 fat beetles, which were as good as plums in plum pudding for Old Brown. Each beetle was wrapped up carefully in a dock leaf, fastened with a pine needle pin. But Nutkin sang as rudely as ever, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, flower of England, fruit of Spain, met together in a shower of rain, put in a bag tied round with a string. If you'll tell me this riddle, I'll give you a ring." Which was ridiculous of Nutkin, because he had not got any ring to give to Old Brown. The other squirrels hunted up and down the nut bushes, but Nutkin gathered robin's pin cushions off a briar bush and stuck them full of pine needle pins. On the 5th day, the squirrels brought a present of wild honey. It was so sweet and sticky that they licked their fingers as they put it down upon the stone. They had stolen it out of a bumblebee's nest on the tippity top of the hill. But Nutkin skipped up and down, singing, Hum-a-bum, buzz, buzz, hum-a-bum, buzz. As I went over Tipple-tine, I met a flock of bonny swine, some yellow-nacked, some yellow-backed. They were the very bonniest swine that e'er went over Tipple-tine. Old Mr. Brown turned up his eyes in disgust at the impertinence of Nutkin. But he ate up the honey. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts. But Nutkin sat upon a big flat rock and played ninepins with a crabapple and green fir cones. On the 6th day, which was Saturday, the squirrels came again for the last time. They brought a new laid egg in a little rush basket as a last parting present for Old Brown. But Nutkin ran in front, laughing and shouting, "Humpty Dumpty lies in the beck, with a white counterpane round his neck. 40 doctors and 40 wrights cannot put Humpty Dumpty to rights." Now old Mr. Brown took an interest in eggs. He opened one eye and shut it again, but still he did not speak. Nutkin became more and more impertinent. "Old Mr. B! Old Mr. B! Hickamore, Hackamore, on the king's kitchen door. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't drive Hickamore, Hackamore off the king's kitchen door." Nutkin danced up and down like a sunbeam, but still Old Brown said nothing at all. Nutkin began again. "Arthur O'Bower has broken his band. He comes roaring up the land. The king of the Scots with all his power cannot turn Arthur of the bower." Nutkin made a whirring noise to sound like the wind, and he took a running jump right onto the head of Old Brown. Then all at once there was a flutterment and a scufflement and a loud squeak. The other squirrels scuttered away into the bushes. When they came back very cautiously, peeping round the tree, there was Old Brown sitting on his doorstep, quite still, with his eyes closed, as if nothing had happened. But Nutkin was in his waistcoat pocket. This looks like the end of the story, but it isn't. Old Brown carried Nutkin into his house and held him up by the tail, intending to skin him. But Nutkin pulled so very hard that his tail broke in two, and he dashed up the staircase and escaped out of the attic window. And to this day, if you meet Nutkin up a tree and ask him a riddle, he will throw sticks at you and stamp his feet and scold and shout. The end. A Tailor of Gloucester, 1903. In the time of swords and periwigs and full-skirted coats with flowered lappets, when gentlemen wore ruffles and gold-laced waistcoats of paduasoy and taffeta, there lived a tailor in Gloucester. He sat in the window of a little shop in Westgate Street, cross-legged on a table, from morning till dark. All day long, while the light lasted, he sewed and snippeted, piecing out his satin and pompadour and lute string. Stuffs had strange names and were very expensive in the days of the Tailor of Gloucester. But although he sewed fine silk for his neighbours, he himself was very, very poor. A little old man in spectacles, with a pinched face, old crooked fingers, and a suit of threadbare clothes. He cut his coats without waste, according to his embroidered cloth. There were very small ends and snippets that lay about upon the table. 2 narrow breadths for naught, except waistcoats for mice, said the tailor. One bitter cold day near Christmas time, the tailor began to make a coat of cherry-coloured corded silk, embroidered with pansies and roses, and a cream-coloured satin waistcoat, trimmed with gauze and green worsted chenille, for the Mayor of Gloucester. The tailor worked, and he talked to himself. He measured the silk and turned it round and round, and trimmed it into shape with his shears. The table was all littered with cherry-coloured snippets. No breadth at all, and cut on the cross, It is no breadth at all. Tippets for mice, and ribbons for mobs, for mice, said the tailor of Gloucester. When the snowflakes came down against the small leaded window panes and shut out the light, the tailor had done his day's work. All the silk and satin lay cut out upon the table. There were 12 pieces for the coat and 4 pieces for the waistcoat, and there were pocket flaps and cuffs and buttons all in order. For the lining of the coat, there was fine yellow taffeta, and for the buttonholes of the waistcoat, there was cherry-coloured twist. And everything was ready to sew together in the morning, all measured and sufficient, except that there was wanting just one single skein of cherry-coloured twisted silk. The tailor came out of his shop at dark, for he did not sleep there at nights. He fastened the window and locked the door and took away the key. No one lived there at night but little brown mice, and they run in and out without any keys. For behind the wooden wainscots of all the old houses in Gloucester, there are little mouse staircases and secret trapdoors, and the mice run from house to house through those long, narrow passages. They can run all over the town without going into the streets. But the tailor came out of his shop and shuffled home through the snow. He lived quite nearby, in College Court, next the doorway to College Green. And although it was not a big house, the tailor was so poor he only rented the kitchen. He lived alone with his cat. It was called Simpkin. Now all day long, while the tailor was out at work, Simpkin kept house by himself, and he was also fond of the mice, though he gave them no satin for coats. "Meow," said the cat when the tailor opened the door. "Meow." The tailor replied, "Simpkin, we shall make our fortune, but I am worn to a ravelly. Take this groat, which is our last fourpence, and Simpkin, take a china pipkin, buy a pennyworth of bread,